Good afternoon. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 12th Annual Toronto City Manager's Address. Today our talk is on implementing the New Deal. They said yes, what happens now? I would also like to welcome those of you who are joining us virtually through live streaming. This is a first for IMFG, so welcome to all of you. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the Director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the School of Cities here at the University of Toronto. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. First, some thank yous. I would like to thank IMFG's external funders, Avana Capital, Maitree, the City of Toronto, the region of Halton, the region of Peel, the region of York, and the region of Durham. I would also like to thank Shanali Chakraborty and Piali Roy at IMFG for doing all the arrangements for today. And I would like to thank Nassim Hashim and Adam Bell at the Monk School for their help in making all of the tech stuff run smoothly, and they always do. If you are posting comments on LinkedIn or other social media platforms, our hashtag is IMFG Talks. So as many of you know, the Toronto City Manager's Address has been one of our flagship events at IMFG, with the first one taking place back in 2012. Last year, we hosted Paul Johnson for the first time as city manager, and we are excited to welcome him back with us today. You may recall that last year Paul talked about the New Deal and asked the question, what if they say yes? Well, a few weeks later, the province did say yes. I don't know if IMFG had anything to do with that or his talk made that happen. But they did say yes, and today Paul is going to follow up on his presentation from last year by sharing information about the New Deal agreement and the partnership and strategies that have informed its implementation. Paul will also look ahead to next steps for the city as it works towards financial sustainability. I would like now to introduce our moderator, who will introduce Paul. Our moderator this afternoon, and back by popular demand, is Sabine Matheson. Sabine has been a principal at Strategy Corp since 1998 and is the founder of Strategy Corp's Municipal Affairs Practice Group. In the past, she served as Chief of Staff to Ontario's Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. She now serves as Strategy Corp's in-house counsel, and she previously practiced law in Toronto with a major Bay Street law firm. Please welcome Sabine Matheson.
Thank you, Enid. You know, for years, I've referred to Enid as the Dame Judi Dench of Ontario municipal finance. She is a national treasure. And I think the municipal sector would be a much sadder place without her. And, you know, I think one of the reasons you can see her influence and the influence of the Institute is when you look around this room, it is literally a who's who of city builders, both elected officials and public servants. And that's the reason I know a big reason why we come here is to support Enid in the work of the Institute. So it's a particular pleasure to be here. It is also of note that Paul is here for the second time. And you know, we were doing some of the negotiations. I mean, there's a reason Paul gets me to be, you know, I'm a bit of a lobbyist, right? I was doing some negotiation on behalf of Paul around the deal we're working on here. And we had said that we would do 6 back-to-back shows to accommodate the people, but they weren't able to get a deal going to actually do an adequate renaming of the monk, you know, after something appropriately sparkly for Paul for the next few days. So we did do this online distribution as well. But, you know, I think if we keep coming back year after year here, we are going to be going for a larger footprint. but that'll be to negotiate next year. Certainly, if Paul pulls off another victory like he did last year with negotiations with the province, the people that'll be coming will be CAOs from all over the province, and we will need a capacity crowd. I'm not going to read Paul's resume at you, because really what's impressive about Paul isn't so much his past as it's his present and his future as a leader for the City of Toronto. You can't talk about Paul without talking about Hamilton, which, as we know, is a city that is much of its future is so linked to Toronto's, and it's a great part of the constellation that is the Toronto area that Paul is now leading on the administrative side. It makes me smile that Paul's background professionally is in history. I take great comfort anytime I see someone achieving high, important leadership roles with backgrounds in the humanities. And it's not that other areas of study aren't appropriately, wonderful. It's that sometimes history and political studies are not appropriately appreciated. And, in Paul, we can see why that area of study is so important. And that's probably another reason why IMFG and the multidisciplinary approach it takes to things is something that I appreciate so much. But Paul also is notable to us because his background before he got into hardcore municipal public service was in the area of service to either the homeless or the underhoused, and in the support of people who needed help. And that, I think, is very much the spirit that he brings to the job that he does every day. So I present to you Paul very much in the role today of the dog who chased the car last year, actually managed to catch it, and who's now going to be talking to us a little bit about what it's been like having the consequences of operating that vehicle for the last year and where he's going to be taking it going forward. So please join me in welcoming Paul Johnson.
Sabine always chooses her words wisely. I notice you say, chase the car and caught it. We'll let that one sink in just for a second. It is wonderful to be back here for a second year. It's wonderful, again, to be in the presence of so many friends and people that I learn from each and every day. It's a bit humbling always to follow, Enid gives a few minutes of introduction, and that's enough to humble me in saying we should be listening more to Enid. And we do. All of us in this room, I think, realize we should listen more to Enid. And for my colleagues, some of whom are in the room, Elaine is here in the room, Aaron is here, John Livy, who has had leadership roles of the City of Toronto, and all sorts of other folks that are in the room. We do know that we must work together if we're going to achieve the kinds of things that municipalities need to do. Today, you're going to hear what you typically hear from me. You're going to hear a story about Toronto, but it's a story that has implications and I think has similarities for other municipalities in this province and across the country. You're going to hear a message of optimism because that is exactly the spirit I bring each and every day to the work we do. You'll hear about the challenges. You will hear about what keeps us up at night collectively, but you'll hear also about the stories of optimism that have me feeling very much that yes is a word that we're going to hear more and more of as we do this work together. And there's going to be a few sports analogies because that's just me too. So get ready for the ride today. So this is me last year. Same suit. Same tie, same colored shoes. I had a bit more of a boiler last year going on. I think I've lost a few pounds, which is good news from a year ago today. Intentional. Because to me, this was really about a long intermission between two parts of the same presentation. Last year's conversation was, what if they say yes? It was predicated on a question that I ask the teams that I work with a lot. We focus so much on, well, what are we going to do if the answer is no? What are we going to do if we don't achieve what we're set out to achieve? How will we ever make things work? And sometimes we miss the important question of, what if they say yes? And the premise of that, Wendy Wahlberg, our city solicitor, here to make sure I don't go to prison, so this is good. Now we're set. Wendy, I can start my real remarks. I was holding off until you were there to give me the thumbs up or the thumbs down. I asked that question because I believe in it. We sometimes don't spend enough time thinking about what if the answer is yes. Because as you'll hear a bit of the story of what happened after last year's presentation, beyond what has been written, beyond the reports that you can read, and the stories that I'll tell, it is about were we prepared as an organization? And last year, again, I talked about the preparation that went into the conversation we had with the provincial government in late 2023. The work that we did on our long-term financial plan that set the table for what became a very important conversation between the province, to a lesser degree, but still an important degree, the federal government, and of course the City of Toronto. So I'm back here in the same suit. I do own more than one suit. It was intentional this year, and don't worry, next year I'll change it. So they did say yes, and let's start with that. A moment that needs to be celebrated. A lot of people said, oh, we need to be planning for no. What are the odds that these two political foes at times and these two political characters at times could ever come up with a deal that would bring some sense of solution to a fiscal and financial challenge that we had at the City of Toronto, which was a crisis last year. We were heading into our budget with a gap of $1.8 billion. We had, as we were going through some of these conversations, we had set the organization on a course of internal study of what a 15% reduction would look like across the board, because it was the only way, with a reasonable property tax increase, that we would have a hope of balancing the budget as required by law if we didn't achieve some level of commitment and partnership from other orders of government. That's the situation we were in. And a lot of people said this isn't going to happen. We wondered if it would happen enough. But what was interesting about the comments that were made in the smiles and the aftermath of the announcement is that much of what we laid out for the reason that we had to have this important conversation was reiterated by the political leadership that got us into the room as public servants in the first place. Sabine is quite kind in saying that I and the team at the city had a role to play in having this happen, and we did. And I want to pay tribute to my colleagues at the Ontario Public Service, because we spent a lot of time together working on this. But no direction from our bosses, no conversations at the staff level. These two individuals were clear in what they wanted us to achieve, and that, as staff, is all that we can ask for. Clear direction, and then we'll go produce some work, bring forward our best advice, and then we get the handshake moment. But look at what the words are on this screen. Our core premise of why this conversation needed to happen was because Toronto's role, provincially and federally, from an economic perspective, is something that could not be denied. Just over 50% of the GDP of this province and 20% of the GDP of this country. You can say, go solve things yourself, Toronto, but you do that at the detriment to the provincial and national economy. That's not an ego statement. The folks in Hamilton think I've drunk the Kool-Aid, right? They really do. They say, oh yeah, you used to be one of those that went Toronto, the old joke, the province of Toronto, all that kind of stuff. But you know what? When you come to Toronto and you really look at what's happening, there is a uniqueness here that has to be understood, and simply the driving factors provincially and federally are undeniable. And it is about, if you look at the mayor's comment, it is about what we can do when we come together. Shared priorities. And so that was the backstop to what turned into some of the headlines that people have seen. I'm going to spend a little less time on these because you've all heard them before. They've been well covered, they've been well documented, and they are the grabbers because they pulled us back from the budget abyss that we were staring into heading into 2024. And they were about an operating injection and a capital injection at a level that made a fundamental difference to the City of Toronto and made it for multiple years so that we could at least take our breath and not be right back at the conversations days or weeks after we got the initial contribution. On the operating side, it was very clear where our challenges lay. A transit system that was trying to recover after the pandemic will never probably recover to exactly where we were pre-pandemic, but needs to adjust and change to the needs of this community and needs to continue to operate in a way that moves people around this city. How do you do that on a property tax base and a fare box base that really is a unique way of running a major transit system around the world? It talked about our shelter needs and our homelessness needs in this city, which are beyond anything that happens in this country. And until such a time as there is a different balance amongst municipalities in terms of how much shelter is provided per capita in other areas, Toronto needs to step up and provide what we do provide. But it simply was crippling our budget. Hundreds of millions of dollars towards an issue that we couldn't turn away from, but also could not sustain on a property tax basis. You know, talking about transit, we're very clear, transit expansion is incredibly important in Toronto. But again, given the financial circumstances we have, these old models of we'll pay for capital as the province and you'll kick in operating as the municipality, those days are changing. The reality is we found it to be very difficult to figure out a path with all the other challenges facing our budget for us to have those operating dollars for the LRT projects that will be coming online as soon as is humanly possible, and the future transit projects that will drive how we move people around this city. On the capital side, it was about investment in the very infrastructure that keeps this city going from a social and cultural perspective, but also from an economic perspective. You know, it's not really a mistruth to say that at some point, line 2 of the subway system would not be very operable if we don't get an investment to allow us to purchase the new cars that need to be on that line. Well, the New Deal said we are 2/3 of the way there. It implored the federal government to step forward, and very pleased that the federal government, through their Permanent Transit Fund, it has a slightly different name now, but the Permanent Transit Fund model has indicated that this is an eligible program for municipalities within that envelope. And that means that we are so close to that 3-way deal to bring those new transit resources to line 2 of our subway system, the east-west connection, which is so lacking in that infrastructure investment here in the city. And then the big piece that came out of our long-term financial plan was the hole in state of good repair. And in an instant, with the New Deal, we unlocked nearly $2 billion of state of good repair resources for the City of Toronto. It was what the eventual upload or transfer of ownership of the Gardner and the DVP will bring. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that has changed some of the fortunes of our budget in a bit. So those were the pieces that were the highlights. But if you read the document, we had some other successes that made this more about money, because to be quite honest, if the New Deal was just about achieving some financial transfers over the next few years, it isn't all that unique and innovative, to be honest. Think about COVID. Municipalities banded together and we received resources as municipalities to help us through a very difficult time, as did individuals and businesses, in the recognition that that pandemic and some of the impacts of the pandemic had crippled our abilities individually and as municipalities to continue on. So those ideas of having municipal asks for resource is not new. Think of the doubling of Reaching Home from the federal government, an acknowledgement of the homelessness issues that are facing communities. What's more of interest to me, and was more of interest to myself and my colleagues around the table, was how the New Deal became a new way of working from a provincial and municipal perspective that would drive the next conversation about how this is sustainable in the future. And so there are things in there, such as the usual chestnuts of here's a bit of money, we celebrate, but there's no commitment in the future. There is a commitment to continue the conversation written within the New Deal, as much a part of the New Deal as the money and the transfers of capital resources and operating resources. It says in 2025, we will define the terms of reference for our discussions. In the initial phase, we didn't have long to do that. We did it in 2 weeks. and then had 7 weeks of discussion at the table, presented our recommendations to the mayor and the premier, and we were off to the races because of the challenge of time. This next conversation will be more complex and longer, because it will be about solving things for a much longer period of time. But it's written in, and in 2026, we will try and fit together those pieces. And by doing that, we will figure out a way to make sure that we have a sustainable peace. That might actually be my phone running off. I don't think I've ticked the premier off yet, have I? I hope not. It might be the mayor saying, what are you talking about? We had some things happen in housing that were new and innovative. And innovative in the way we're partnering, not innovative in ideas. We actually said in the New Deal, you know what, we have public land, municipally owned land, provincially owned land, and we talk about how we can use that collectively, and you know what, 10 years later, we're still talking about how we can use it collectively. How about we set ourselves some different time frames? And we did. Find a demonstration piece of land, either owned municipally or provincially, within 6 months, and have an agreement to build some affordable home ownership housing on that site. We did it in 6 months, and we will be announcing very soon what this project will look like and how it's going to be delivered very quickly. Our stretch goal was find another 4 properties before the end of 2024, and let's keep doing this and learning as we go. And I'm going to tell a story about the change in relationship, and you're going to say, oh man, that is such a tiny change in how you do things that can't possibly be a success. But think about it as we extrapolate it out about relationships. So we had one of those moments early on in this conversation about our first demonstration site that always happens when 2 orders of government get together. We had to do some due diligence work, and it was going to cost about $150,000. And the next conversation was, how do we cost share it? Is it 50-50? Well, it was a municipal piece of land. Maybe the municipality should take a greater share and this and that. And then it was about process, and our process is this and that. And finally, I just said, you know what? We'll cover this. We have the resources set aside in a fund I can use. Let's do the due diligence. We know it has to be done. And to be honest, if we are going to develop housing on this site, the $150,000 is not where we should be wasting our time. And the answer was, oh, this is how we're going to do it. Instead of always trying to figure out how we can say that we paid our share or did our share or appropriately shared those resources, we said, look, we're moving together. Some days that means the city will step up and do it because we can in a faster, more expeditious way, or we have the resource there. Other times we're going to have to look to the province, and then maybe collectively we're going to have to look somewhere else, maybe the federal government or the private sector, to find ways to make this happen. But let's spend less time trying to paper how we can convince each other that we've paid our fair share, and more think about how at the end of the day we share in the outcome, which is to build housing in this community. On the waterfront, the New Deal says we need to make sure that we continue the momentum on the waterfront. There may be over 100,000 people in a generation who end up living in the areas that will be developed down at the waterfront here in Toronto. And it's not just about housing, although that's a key piece and piece that's very important to people right now. It's also about how we'll be welcoming people to that very, very important piece of our city and our province, and how we will protect it from an ecological perspective and protect it from a sustainability perspective. And if you haven't seen the flood protection work that has just been completed, it is, I'm not impressed by much, like impressed by much. And when you watch the time-lapse video of how the river fills up, if you watch the way that this project came together, you can't help but be impressed by the engineering that is going to allow us to develop some of that area and protect us in a sustainable way from the effects of climate change. And the province along the way said to the city, we need to understand what you're doing to continuously improve your services. And there's maybe a little bit of it, which is, we better understand, that you're efficient, and we've got a few ideas of where your inefficiencies lie. But really what it became was, we just don't know. I will tell you, having worked in 2 municipalities and having the luxury of being, close colleagues with many other leaders in municipalities, some of the most innovative work, some of the strongest continuous improvement work is happening in municipalities. The challenge is we don't talk about it enough. We sometimes show it as a line item in the budget. We saved $50 million or $200 million in efficiencies, and it kind of slides by as we look at property tax increases and other things. But what we agreed to was, let's talk with each other about ways that we've collectively found to improve service delivery, to sometimes save money, not always for the benefit of saving that money, but allowing that money to be reinvested at a net zero level in other things that are important to us. And so all of these pieces along the way that were about a different relationship, we're even toying with aligning our fiscal years. I don't know whether that one will happen or not. It may be more work than it's worth at the end of the day. But we were thinking through the whole New Deal about how is this not just a document that solves an immediate, near-term financial challenge for the City of Toronto and is a transfer of resources from the province of Ontario. And that's why I'm proud of the work that we did together. That's not pride for my work. It's the pride of our work. So I encourage people always, because it's only about 6 or 7 pages, to read the New Deal beyond the table at the back that talks about all the money. Dig into it and see how we've accelerated the potential for development of housing around a new transit stop at Woodbine. We've taken it from a 4 or 5 year process to a 12-month process. Look at the ways that we moved to get our agreement in principle around the subways in 6 months, where it was languishing. It was a back and forth conversation that is going to go on forever. We need to understand how we will design and build and operate those new subway systems in Toronto as they come online, and we need to start working on that today so that we can just get on with the construction and move to completion. Those are the things that said to me this is a new deal and not just an intergovernmental discussion around transfer of money. First sports analogy of the day. But it can be used in any piece because it's true. You don't earn the trophy when the confetti's coming down at the end of the Super Bowl. You earn that in the hours where no one's watching. And this is really the work that we've been doing since that celebratory handshake and the press conference around the announcement of the New Deal. Because the next day we were smiling a fair bit, and then we got a lot of work to do. We set time. We have a huge project team working on, these are just a few of them. We've put them up like they're playing cards or sports cards, but they are huge amounts of work. The due diligence on the Gardner alone just floors me every time that I look at it. Kate Basil, who is here tonight, who works with me in the city manager's office, she leads this team that is out there doing all sorts of things. And we're learning from each other. The differences between the way the province treats an asset like a highway and the way the city has. We're learning about how we can execute agreements faster. We did a transfer payment agreement around some of that money within 90 days. As I say, we got our subway agreement in principle within the 6 months, and we nailed it on the timing. And there are a number of things here, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, that have been spurred on by the fact that this is not a one-way deal. What do we receive from the province and the federal government? It is a partnership deal, and that means what are we going to do to play our position within this New Deal structure? But you know what? This is where the work is being put in to achieve the success of the New Deal. Yes, some money transferred rather quickly, but I can tell you one thing, if we don't have a team doing the due diligence, we are going to miss the opportunity to transfer that ownership and see the Gardner and the Don Valley Parkway be part of a provincial set of assets, absolutely freeing up that state of good repair money for us to use in other critical categories for the City of Toronto. If we don't work together to finish projects like East Harbour, which will unlock thousands of units of housing, an incredible transit hub that will benefit both the TTC as well as the GO network, then we are not going to achieve the things we need to in order to move people around this city as we go forward. And it goes on and on and on in terms of the things that we need to get done. And this is where the real work of these deals comes into play. So last time I spoke, a year ago, it was about, are we ready with the information to make the compelling case to other orders of government about why a new deal is necessary? Now it's to demonstrate that when we come up with those partnership agreements, that we have the teams in place to deliver. I will tell you, this is not easy. There are bad days as we've been working through some of these. The beauty of having a deal come together in 7 weeks is people go, wow, that's lightning speed for 2 orders of government. It is. Sometimes the downside is the language, a little less than precise. You can talk to Wendy Wahlberg about that afterwards. She looked at the new deal and went, seriously, we're signing this? And I said, yeah, we are. And the mayor said, yeah, we are. And she said, okay, do you know what some of those words mean? And we're like, we think so. And you know what? We've had to put in structures in place to have those conversations, sometimes between the 2 people that you saw shaking hands at the end of the day, to say, look, we had a conversation about this. What did we mean when we said the provision of lands and easements to accelerate some of the extension work that's happening on our LRT projects? What did we mean when we said we're going to expedite this? Expedite in our language is going from 4 to 5 years to 12 months. Expedite in someone else's language might be, how do we do this next week? Those are the things that are tough. On each side, we've realized that not always do we have all the resources we need to move at the pace we need to. That's the tough stuff of making deals come together. But the optimistic message is, when we have that clear direction, when we have that clear community of work that's happening amongst the public service and elected officials, we can make good things happen. A big part of my conversation last year and the long-term financial plan, if you haven't seen it, it's a great tool. And if you have, you know that what it demonstrated was the long-term financial plan was not an ask for the help to make us whole. The long-term financial plan said the City of Toronto had to control and play its part on a number of fronts. And the long-term financial plan challenged the City of Toronto to do more. What it also said is we could not do it alone. It was the 40%, if you remember the graph. 40% lying within what the City of Toronto can manage, and that's a combination of property taxes, it's other revenue sources, it's our own ability to manage cost and the delivery of service, it's looking at what we do and how we do it. And then we said there is a 60% where we really need some help. Some of that's about the cost share programs. They need to keep pace. It's wonderful that we deliver services on behalf of other orders of government. It's a fantastic way to do it because we understand best in our communities, whether we're in Peel or in Hamilton or in York or in Durham, we know best. However, that thing starts to fall apart when the resources in this cost share piece are held at 2018 levels. So we had some need for some help along the way. But as part of our commitment to the New Deal and part of our commitment to demonstrating that the City of Toronto takes this very seriously, we have been focusing on what we can control. And I want to give Council a huge amount of credit for the courage that they've taken in certain cases. You might remember that the long-term financial plan laid out that the City of Toronto's property tax rates trailed a little bit behind our other municipalities that surrounded us in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Now, some people said it was like 40, 50% below. Not true. But there was a gap. And so that has been an area where there's been some focus. A 5.5% tax increase in 2023 and an 8% property tax increase in 2024. On top of that, a commitment for another decade of a yearly 1.5% city building levy that is there for capital initiatives, mainly in transit and housing. Over the next 10 years, that contribution by the property taxpayers of the City of Toronto will unlock $5.5 billion worth of capital projects. So when I hear other orders of government saying, all you want us to do is come in and save you, you're looking for these programs, I say, we are doing our part. Torontonians are doing their part. We cannot solve the capital problem ourselves, but we are willing to step up. It's things like looking at the ways our revenue tools can be better utilized. We have a graduated vacant home tax, and while that's not there for a long-term stream of revenue, right now it is helping us with some housing-related programs. We received approval from council to bring back an implementation strategy on a commercial parking levy. Not very popular. But the courage of council to say yes. A capital prioritization framework, which has already seen council defer or outright say we are not moving forward with some new capital initiatives while we focus on state of good repair and priority capital projects across the city. Those are painful discussions because we want it all. We should have it all. I don't deny that for a second, but we've brought forward a process which allows it to be less based on speeches and motions and more based on a process that says, based on what we need to achieve as a city and what you've declared as priorities, council, here's where these things net out. It's not always what you're going to want to hear. You always have the right to change the result, but we think by doing that, we inject a bit more rigor around that. Remember I talked about that $1.9 billion that instantly unlocked from the Gardner upload state of good repair resources? The beauty of it was that it wasn't tied to development charges and a lot of other funding streams, so it was really money that the city could reinvest in state of good repair, bring a whole bunch of things above the line, as we call it. Our chief financial officer brought forward a report and said that money should go 100% to state of good repair, and it should go in only a few categories. The one anomaly to that was it allowed us to invest a bit more money to complete the East Harbor. It was part of our negotiations at the New Deal. The rest of it, housing, parks and recreation, transit, looking at our corporate facilities to ensure that they are sound facilities for the future. Barely a question at committee or council. Passed the fastest I've ever seen. We had spent a bit of it on some early initiatives, so it was about $1.75 billion. The fastest I've ever seen $1.75 billion go through without discussion. Because council had realized and had had conversations about where we need to focus our attention. We do need to look at being very focused at helping our state of good repair backlog. And I know there are some that will say, but Paul, last year you talked about the $26 billion of state of good repair backlog. And this is, $1.9 billion. Well, I'll give you the answer I give to everybody else. I don't have, and the City of Toronto doesn't have too many $1.9 billion days that allows us to reinvest into state of good repair. It's a demonstration of what's possible. Can the province of Ontario absorb an asset which will put a pressure on their overall budget and capital resources? The answer apparently is yes, because they agreed to it. It unlocks an ability for us to do something. It's not a grant program. It's not some complicated mechanism. And we followed through and said, we are not going to take this and do other things with it. We will use this for what we said we needed to do as a priority, and that is address state of good repair. We did have I will make comment because I think it's important to give credit where credit is due to all the partners. There is a benefit to what's happening that's already being seen. Our opening budget pressure last year, $1.8 billion. This year, our opening budget pressure of $1.2 billion. That is a result of the work we've done and the result of the investments that has happened through the New Deal. Our goal is to get that down to a more manageable and a more normal opening pressure that can be accommodated through a reasonable tax increase and other things that the city can control. As I say, we've been doing some work on capital prioritization. It all led to Standard & Poor's increasing our credit rating, first time in over 2 decades. And they did so because they noted the partnerships between other orders of government, assisting in the financial sustainability of the City of Toronto, and looked at the way we were prioritizing, doing multi-year budgeting, all of those fundamentals, and they said, this is a good news story. So I think the early things are there. I love this quote. When you get to the end zone, act like you've been there before. If you watch football, sometimes you see somebody get into the end zone and it's as though they have won the Super Bowl of all Super Bowls. And then you see their stat line and it's the first time they've ever scored a touchdown. I understand enthusiasm, but how about you show that you want to be there before, you want to be there now, and you want to be there in the future. And that's what we're going to do as we move forward. Everybody's interested in what does the New Deal look like moving forward. And I've laid out some of it. We are starting the conversations with the province to build the terms of reference. It's a really important tool. If we don't know what we should be talking about at the table as public servants, it's not going to be a very effective process. And that was some of the key work that happened between the Premier and the Mayor to give us the clear area that we worked in the first New Deal. It meant we didn't have certain conversations. For instance, about new and innovative revenue sharing options. It just was not something that was there in that 7 weeks of burst activity. So we need to do that work and then get on with it. And so we're going to build on the way that we had good success in the 7 weeks of last year. And because we're going to have a bit more time, build on those principles and those fundamentals that really led to a very good discussion back and forth between officials. We are going to continue to talk about what isn't changing for the City of Toronto. We still have challenges in the area of transit, housing, and shelter. We still have emerging challenges in emergency services, which we chose not to really address the last time because we needed more information and more time to digest that. And so we need to have these conversations, and some of them will be the same. We will continue to focus on what is unique about Toronto. And I know that my municipal colleagues, some very nervous. Are you going to cut a completely new deal around municipal and provincial relationships where we have some of these very same challenges? And we've been very true to trying to focus on the uniqueness while saying at times, this really needs to be a conversation across 444 municipalities, not just one. So we're going to continue to focus on what's unique about Toronto and be unabashedly clear that those uniquenesses are not problems that we have to deal with. They are challenges and opportunities that we have to deal with collectively. And then, of course, just like we had to deal with the first time, there's emerging pressures. When we spoke at the table about housing, it was looking at ways that we could partner on bringing land into the equation. Today, the prevalence of free land is not good enough to build housing, let alone affordable housing. We have a sector building housing right now that is starting to sputter and may have that engine almost shut right off. My Hamilton roots, it's like those coke ovens down at Stelco and Dofasco. You don't want them to go cold because starting those suckers back up is a long, torturous process. What you want to do at times is sometimes scale it back, but keep pumping out some steel, right? If there's any steel workers in there saying that is a horrible, horrible generalization of steel making. But I have it on good authority. It's kind of half right. Those ovens need to keep going if you have any indication that you want to fire it back up later. Shutting them down is a long process. So we want to deal with housing in a different way now. And just last month, Toronto City Council taking some courageous steps around that. We were utilizing some resources provincially and federally, the Housing Accelerator Fund federally, the Building Faster Fund resources that we received provincially, and we were able to advance some affordable housing work with nonprofit providers and co-op providers back in June. Well, the whole fundamentals of penciling these deals changes. And all of a sudden in November, we're sitting there saying we're going to have to defer indefinitely development charges for what is now 7,000 units of purpose-built rental. That is entirely being borne by the City of Toronto. That's the max we can do in order to protect over a long period of time what our infrastructure needs are going to be. And on top of that, looking at reducing property taxes so that we combine to provide nearly $97,000 in indefinite deferrals, really taking $97,000 out of the per unit cost of building housing as a way to keep moving. The relationship there is 20% affordable. We have to continue to make sure that the continuum of housing is front and center at all times. And we're going to have to look at some of those more creative ideas. And I imagine when we get at the table, because even if it's late 2025 and into 2026, I don't see this turning around that quickly. We're going to have different discussions about what a partnership around housing looks like. It cannot simply be municipalities and your DCs. Then how do we build infrastructure? Nor can it be us saying that we are just going to continue to drive the way we've been driving before, or we will not see housing construction in our communities. And that is a detriment to everybody. And in the City of Toronto, given the growth projections of population that we're looking at over the next 10 to 20 years, it would be devastating to this city's future potential. So we're going to have to deal with some of those emerging issues. But we're going to do it in the same way we've done it from day one when we sat at the table, that this is not just a transactional piece about money. If it were that easy and if it were that simple, it wouldn't involve as many people. And quite frankly, I don't know that I'd even be at the table. Get the CFO and the Deputy Minister of Finance, they can push the paper across, we need this, he'll give you this, whatever, and we'll get it done. This has to be about more of how Toronto and Ontario will continue to be partners, not only in the good order and development of this city, but also making sure that we continue to drive the economic output that we need provincially and federally. And I haven't talked a lot about the federal government because it's trickier for them. You know, they do have a whole country. We are 20%. There are other cities that contribute significantly. But I was very thankful and impressed at their contribution to the first New Deal. And we will be more intentional in how they can come to the table in the second New Deal. Because at the end of the day, we are a crew of three. 37 years I've refereed basketball. It's the longest continual thing I've done in my life, other than breathe. I'd love to referee at this level. I tell the mayor every day, there's only one job that I will disappear with no notice on, is if the NBA calls and says, we need you tonight at Scotia. We've had an official go down and we hear you're the best in Canada. First thing I'll say is you heard wrong, but anyways, away we go. It's interesting how the work that we're doing between three orders of government is a little bit like the crews of three that I go out with at my level of refereeing, the college level and the elite high school level. You know, there's three of us on the court that have one goal. These three officials are out there to ensure a fair contest. They're out there to ensure that the people that count on them to make that game happen, because without officials, it's just pickup. If they're there, the game can happen. All of the economics behind professional basketball can happen. So they're out there with a purpose, a higher purpose of ensuring a fair contest, an additional purpose of making sure that the economics of the NBA can continue to work. But what's interesting about basketball officials is not any one of those officials can overrule the other on a call. There's an independence. We have our primary coverage areas, but we also extend to help our partners out. Because if all we do is look in our area and we walk off the court and I was 100% in my area, whoever's evaluating me at my level will say, you are a terrible crew, because I doubt the game was officiated very well. It is about how these three individuals will support each other, will back off and allow the other to take movement forward. And all of that is not a lesson in basketball officiating, although given our numbers are dwindling, if you want to sign up, I'll tell you how after this. It really is to say this crew of three, federal, provincial, and municipal, must work in similar ways. I am not naive that we're all just going to sing off the same song sheet, rewrite history, maybe rewrite the Constitution, and make it all go away. There will be times where we question each other. Maybe that's what's happening here. What did you see on that play? Because I'm not sure I saw what you saw. We'll have those moments. It's okay. Our goal is the same, so let's get into it. Let's be a crew of three. Let's understand each other's needs, desires, help each other out, and get there. It's exactly what happened last year. It's exactly what's driving some of the work over the next 3 years for the City of Toronto, and it is what will be the premise of how we move forward with other discussions and relationships with the province of Ontario and the Government of Canada. If we do that well, I believe, and I am optimistic, that we will see even more things happen. It will not be everything that we want. It may not be everything that we need, but it will continue to move us in the right direction. And what I hope is that we continue to be the beginning point of conversations for all municipalities to continue to talk about what all municipalities need to be successful. So again, this story is the story of Toronto, but it is also the story of all municipalities. Last year, for you, those of you who listened to me, you'll know that in an effort to be cool, I put in a slide about Taylor Swift. I would be remiss if I didn't put one in after a very successful 2 weeks in which we hosted 6 concerts by this amazing businesswoman and artist. But some things never change. My dad joke last year was we need a Taylor tax and we need it swiftly. The economic numbers are starting to come in from these last 2 weeks. From a purely financing perspective at levels of government, we expect at the City of Toronto to see an uptick in revenues of about $250,000. From the municipal accommodation tax, which is really the only lever that we have with these big events. Do not take away for a second that I don't want these types of events in the city. I'm a huge believer in this because it drives local businesses. You see the numbers about how much busier they've been. It drives opportunity, and that is great because we want our business people and individuals we want people to visit here. All that is great stuff. But from a municipal and provincial and federal sharing perspective of revenue, the tens into hundreds of millions of dollars of economic activity, imagine if that was shared a third, a third, a third. The same way we're going to deliver new subway cars on Line 2. The same way we often fund a number of other municipal infrastructure projects. And sometimes when we're only dealing with 2 orders of government, the 50-50 share we do to recognize that we each have an equal share in this. The share is not equal, and so some things never change. I hope to heck the next Taylor Swift chooses Toronto for 6 nights. I hope to heck to see an amazing experience with all of the events that will come in 2025 and 2026, not the least of which is the World Cup, which will be in our city in the summer of 2026. I want it all, but some things never change. To be continued. Thanks so much.
I don't know. I think he deserves another round of applause for that. Will you join me on that? I'm glad my notepad had a lot of pages in it because I kept waiting for the fluffy part where I didn't have to practice my shorthand, and I'm not sure there was one. But we're going to I'm going to ask a few questions, then we're going to open the floor in a little bit. I'm curious, Paul, what's the biggest surprise you had over the course of that negotiation? Because, I mean, you and I talked a lot about, before as we were getting ready to go into it, talked a lot about the preparation that you did and the things that we were concerned about. What was the biggest thing that you're going to take out of it that you were going to want to apply next time?
Quite frankly, it was the focus. You know, I've been around a while. You get into a lot of these rooms. We convene these tables. We have these conversations, sometimes in closed, sometimes open. And it is always with the best of intentions, but I fail to see what the focus is that's going to move us forward. The Premier and the Mayor focused. Here's what you're going to work on. Here's how it's going to go. Here's what's off the table for discussion. Thank you. Very good to have focus. Here's the time frame that we expect you to do your work. Again, this is all 101 stuff of how you run an effective organization, right? Clarity of task, clarity of time, and then let good people go and do the work. And both the Mayor and the Premier said, look, we trust you. Get into that room, bring us back your best thinking. Of course, we're checking in all the time, so we had a good pulse of things. This wasn't done in a box. But it was that focus, because I have not been a part in sort of these bilateral and, at the end of the day, trilateral agreements that have been quite as focused on getting to a successful outcome. Not everything we wanted, any of us, ended up entirely in the deal, but it was a very focused conversation, and in 7 weeks, I think a really good start to what we need to accomplish. And to get that politically as well as bureaucratically isn't always the case.
Yeah. Now, you know, we've often said as we sat around grumbling about the province, because as you know, these days I grumble about the province. It used to be I grumbled about the municipal sector. But when we sit around grumbling about the province, we often say, oh my gosh, the things they don't understand. why can't Enid be the Deputy Minister of Finance, like somebody who understands municipal finance? How did you go about building the bridge to get the province to understand? We were arguing with them about the reserves. We were arguing with them about the role of DCs. How did you build that bridge at the same time as you were trying to cross it?
We became a learning group. It was a small team of us that was at the table, and we said at the beginning, we want to start by learning. So the thought might have been that we go in day one, we got our sheet, we pound the desk, and we're like, and then we just work at crossing things off and whatever. We actually didn't do that. We didn't develop within the room a term sheet for a number of weeks. What we did is we asked questions and we learned. The good news was we had a document that had already been produced, a long-term financial plan, which was really solid work. But then they were asking questions about, what is your budgeting process? How do you go through that? What other documents can we achieve? We asked questions about what was possible with this. The Gardner was an interesting discussion, and I can't go into all the things that were said in the room, but it's an interesting one, right? Because there are other ways. It's not, nobody wants to take up an asset like that. Let's be real clear. We wanted to get rid of it, and I'm not so sure we had a perfect willing buyer. We had a willing seller, that's for sure, but I'm not sure we had a willing buyer. But you know what? When we worked through, so what are other alternatives? I said, look, if we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple $2 billion of capital financing, like what can work? Can you do this? And the province said, that's really tough because of this and this. And so we learned about where there were constraints on either side. Our processes are different. And, I thought those first couple of weeks of being a learning group was what helped us to then get down to, we understand each other a little bit better. It's why we couldn't talk about a lot of things, because we didn't have enough time to learn about everything. So we kept it tight, we kept it close, and then, that's why I think this second process is going to take a lot longer.
Now, you were saying that there were some things that the Toronto side learned from the province that you thought might be beneficial. Are there any things that come to mind that, I think you mentioned something about the way you think about an asset, like the Gardner or the DVP in Toronto versus the way the province thinks about it. Are there any things that are going to wind up changing the way the city does business as we get a little bit of provincial peanut butter in our municipal chocolate, or to make a peanut butter cup of fiscal happiness?
Well, to be honest, we asked them lots about their way of approvals financially, because one of the things that was in the long-term financial plan, and something we're still working on, our budget chief, Councillor Carroll is very enthusiastic about looking at ways that we do our financial approvals differently at the municipal level. We're never going to get to a kind of cabinet, treasury board in the same way that provincially and federally we have. But one of the ideas that we floated is, how do we have a different way? Municipally, sometimes financial things are quite frankly done by member motions, within a 2-day council period. And how do we have a different lens on that? So we asked a lot of questions about their approval process and their mechanism for making some of these decisions, and also how they're more flexible in year. Our budget process is pretty inflexible in year. They have a bit more flexibility. So I think we're taking some of that on board, because what we'd really like to present council is some options that also help them to feel that they can bring forward ideas for things they'd like to see happen. So that was a big learning that we took away. I think some of us knew it by name and somewhat by process, but they allowed us to see a bit more behind the curtains of how they make their decisions.
So the most Western movies had gunfights that were only two-way. And I think it was the good and the bad and the ugly that gave us the innovation of the first three-way gunfight. And you were talking about the team of three. And there are times when it's a team of three, but there are other times when it feels a bit more like a three-way gunfight. And I'm just curious whether, what's the effect when you have, all the admirable optimism that you have right now, that you were sharing with us? What's it like when you open up your phone and you go to Twitter and you see some of the gunfighty stuff that happens? I mean, how do you maintain the enthusiasm on the teams that are trying to work forward when you fall into some of the behaviors that don't feel motivated by that same goal-driven optimism? I mean, how do you do that?
I think when you're in this world, the noise is always going to be around. If we live that it has to be this perfect kind of everybody's focused, there's no noise outside, there's no things that are ticking each other off, you won't get anywhere. Stay focused on the core, which is why we talked about things that were clearly of mutual interest. That's really important. Otherwise, why bother? And the reality is the big things right now, federally, provincially, and municipally, they're pretty clear what we need, and housing and affordability would be right up there. So it's not hard to say to folks, like, it's okay. Don't forget, people say now, is it going to be difficult because of Bill 212 and the bike lane thing? Is it going to be difficult to get in the room and talk about the New Deal? No, it's not. Because don't forget, in the other deal, we were still kind of a bit sore about another bill called Bill 23 that took away some of the DCs and stuff. And we had written angry letters and passed, I'm sure, very angry motions at council and demanded this and that. So I think there's always those pieces around the edges that will be there. I do think that it's a real credit to the political staff and the political leaders to keep talking at the level of how do we work on the stuff together. We didn't have a great start with the federal government with the New Deal, that New Deal 1.0, if you want. We basically tried to almost guilt them into coming, and then we did get them there. We were already deep into it. And it wasn't a very respectful way. They didn't get the chance to learn. They really didn't get the chance to talk. We just said, this is what we actually said, this is what we've already put in your column. Not our finest moment in terms of how to endear ourselves. So yeah, the Deputy Minister of Finance federally had a few choice words for myself and the Deputy Minister of Finance provincially. But then we stepped back and we said, you're right, sorry. And then we also said, how? Our end date can't change on this. So how can we involve you in a way that is meaningful? And I think when you look at what's happened, the investment that was made around refugee and asylum seekers, which unlocked shelter resources for non-refugee and asylum seekers, that can't be underscored enough. It's around $400 million on an annual basis into homelessness of some way, shape, or form. That's pretty good news. When you think about the federal government really thinking through how can we be the true last third of that piece of the puzzle for the TTC and the Line 2 subway system, those are good things. So again, we stepped back and we said, look, there's got to be some things we agree on. We maybe didn't start this off in the way you maybe don't feel like you're a crew of three on this first thing, and we'll learn from that moving forward because it's really important we do have a crew of three moving ahead.
So on that theme of moving ahead, I think it was, certainly exceeded the expectations of many that you got a deal that you did when you got it. But the limitations on that deal speak to the time-limited factor on it, and then its contribution relative to the overall whole. So what do you see the next couple of years looking like? Like, if you're giving us a foretaste of where you think we're going to be as we go into this next, what's the preparation going to look like, and what are the key issues that we should be watching as it moves ahead?
So two things, can we deliver? And that's why I put up the slide about all the pieces of work and the packets of work. I like the project chart that I get on a regular basis. I like it. Most things are trending on time. There's a few things we just have like little things to finish off, or like 95% there. But we have to demonstrate that we could actually work on this. Real easy to transfer money. We're giving you $100 million for 3 years, once a year. That's easy. We have transfer payment agreements and it's done. Some of those other pieces are a little trickier. And the fact that we've been nailing time frames, the fact that we've been able to politically, big credit to the ministers and the premier, as well as the mayor and many councillors, that we've been able to deliver. Because right at the top of the New Deal, it says, this is what we've agreed to, but it is subject to the authorities and the decision-making of council and the province of Ontario. There are some things that the mayor, even with strong mayor powers, can't just sign off on and say, good to go. So we've had to bring things to council that have been tricky. And I think the delivery is one thing we have to be able to demonstrate. There aren't too many politicians that are going to say, yeah, I'll sign up to do more of this, when you haven't really been able to do anything on this side, particularly if you're the province. And it's like, well, you took the money pretty fast. We noticed that transfer went into your account pretty quickly. But where we asked you to help us unlock some property so we can build transit faster, or to work with us on delivering housing in this project or this project, and we said 6 months, and we're now 24 months in and we're no closer, those make it more difficult. So we got to deliver. And then the second piece is we will really have to demonstrate how we would structure a longer term and what I would see as a forever term way. Because it's impossible to say that, for instance, we need X amount every year indexed, because maybe things change. One of the interesting pieces we're doing is we're building 20 shelters in the next 5 years, a total of 1,600 spaces. It will cut in half the cost of those spaces that are in external spaces like hotels right now. Cut it in half. So for the next 5 years, our cost of shelter delivery for that same 1,600 is X. In 5 years, it's going to be Y. So if I say, well, we need X, what times do we review that? Not review it as in whether we will achieve any investment, but how do we review what the investment looks like? And I think that's going to be part of the challenge. And then the second piece is, really looking at what is the level of support and the best way to do that. Lots of people have asked, including a couple that may be in the front row here. They've said, are we going to get a share of the sales tax or income tax? And the answer is, I don't know, and it would be great if we did. I know models around the world that show that. I can look at cities where that is something that works in a way of diversifying the revenue sources, and it's something that grows with, growth-related revenue sources would be lovely. But I will say I'm a bit agnostic. I know what the overall challenge and pressure is. Our CFO can very clearly lay out what that looks like. And if it is that is the way to go, so be it. It may be my preference as Paul Johnson. It may even be the evidence-based way to go. But there might be another way to do it, and we have to be open to that. Because I think if we get into this next piece saying the only way to solve this is this construct, we'll fight about the construct, and then we'll miss the opportunity. We went into the first round of discussions by saying we will not be able to close the gap on our budget without significant impacts to the people who live, work, play, and learn in the city of Toronto. So we need to figure out a way to do that. It's not a zero-sum game of this is the number, get to the number. It is about how do we make sure that we can accommodate this in a way that doesn't impact Torontonians. And I think this next piece is going to be how do we do this in a way that allows us to see that consistent way of doing it. And I'm open to the creativity of that table and others to help us work through what the best approach to that is. And I think those are the two pieces that we'll be focusing on that are different from what we had as a bit of our focus and approach last year.
So I'm going to be opening the floor after this one last question, so start furiously deciding what it is that you want to ask. So, Paul, my last question is, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of anxiety about the city appearing to be run down, issues that people were concerned about, things not working very well. And that was one thought wave. And yet at the same time, if you know where to look, there's so many amazing things that go on in the city all the time, whether they're the product of citizens or whether they're the product of government working with citizens or whether they're just the product of government. And after the New Deal negotiation, we heard the mayor talking a lot about, as a result of this new funding, we're going to be able to do more. And yet, as I still work through the post-traumatic stress disorder of reading the long-term financial plan, it felt like an awful lot of the future wasn't so much about doing more for more. It was about paying more to do what we ought to have been doing for a long time but couldn't afford to do enough of. And so a great sort of important thing, but frankly not dressed up in the rabbit suit of hey, we're doing more for more. It's going to be great. It was kind of like, well, thank God we're going to be able to do that, because otherwise we were going to have to shut it or take it down. And What do you think the next few years is going to be more like? Is it going to be about seeing the green shoots of new things, or is it going to be about seeing some new things and taking care of things that might have been perceived as running down? Or do you think there's a whole bunch of new challenges that are coming that we got to be getting ready for, that are going to knock us off in terms of being able to come up with some of the new ideas? Because I think a lot of that approach around the Treasury Board was to kind of keep councillors from coming up with unfunded cool ideas and to just make sure you could be taking care of business. So what's the next couple of years? What should we be ready for?
Yeah, so I mean, the disruptor has been this whole housing piece. It's just really clear that we need to look at different tools, and we're exploring those different tools around housing. So that's, that's a challenge and an opportunity, and exciting in one sense. It's a real drag in another sense, because there's only so many resources, and so taking resources away or adding resources in, it's still resources that go against something else. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. We're going to have to divert some of our attention and resources, as we have, and as Council did last month, to ensuring that we can keep some amount of the engine of housing construction going. I do think the commitment of Council, and certainly my conversations with the Mayor as well, is we do need to build back to the standard first, and then look at what new can be placed on top of it. That doesn't mean we're not doing targeted new investments. If you look at library hours, they're up. If you look at some of the investments we've made in things like recreation and parks, they're up. If you look at the expansion of the Toronto Community Crisis Service, it now covers 100% of Toronto and offers a non-emergency and non-police response to mental health issues in the community. So we are doing new investments. They, compared to the amount of resources that have flowed in to help our budget balance, much of that has gone to making sure that we can maintain service. And that was a tough conversation that we had to have internally with our divisions, with our politicians, which is, you're going to see a lot of resource needed to make our budget work. Our expectation and our work is that that's going to be a partnership with other orders of government. A lot of money is going to come, and that's going to make sure that we didn't have to bring you a really difficult message. So, so the last piece is that as we galvanize ourselves as a public service, we really are talking about where is it that we need to ensure that we're meeting a service standard, that we're meeting the needs of this community. And the work we just released, we did it in the late part of the summer, polling results from some of our services and things across the community. The positive is when people have interactions with the public service, whether that's in programs like recreation and libraries and in our parks, for instance, they're very positive. They think our infrastructure could use a little bit of work. How do we get around? And that's on all modes. And also, you know what? I really like my rec center programming, that whether it's an aquatics class or a fitness class is just awesome. And then I go to the change room and the washroom, and you could do a bit of work there. So the focus is, where are people telling us we can get some good bang for the buck? And the Mayor and I have this conversation about, when we're looking at those targeted new investments, what's the impact? Recreation, we have about 1 million visitors a year. That's high impact. Maybe another issue, it's 10,000 people a year. We might have to make a different decision. So I think you'll see us trying to continue to get back to a base level of service that people expect and demand in this city, some targeted new investments. But the big wobbler for me right now is, how do we ensure we keep the housing engine going here and focus on still the continuum of housing, not just ensuring that condo development or private home ownership development is done. We need to see it across the board, and that's a tough one right now, because it appears that our old tools are not going to be good enough to allow that to continue.
Thank you. So, who would like to ask a question? We've got a microphone perhaps in the front row. Ladies, if you just introduce yourself very, very quickly, we'll try and keep them quick. I'd like to try and get through about 5 or 6 questions before we run out of time. So, Paul, short answers, short questions.
There's no clock in this room, so I'm going on forever. It's beautiful.
I appreciate your optimism. It's nice to hear people be very optimistic about the future. But it's also a little bit jarring because the New Deal, which you said was such a good deal today, many people saw as Toronto selling out, of literally selling the farm to pay this year's bills, but wouldn't be able to grow next year's food. And so what do you say to the people who thought it was a really bad idea to sell infrastructure? The mayor had campaigned against it. She'd had a component who said the opposite, and she beat partially on this issue of people saying, we want to be in control, we don't want the province to be in control. What do you say to people who are worried about this sort of loss of autonomy, loss of self-governance that comes with this, with Bill 212, with all of the other things that come with it?
So a mixture there, and we can have, I think Bill 212, council's weighed in and said this is something to be, keep a close eye on, because the real local decisions need to be local decisions, and that becomes worrying. If I go back to the New Deal, I think for successive years we've looked at it. Highways are not a great use of municipal time, and I don't know that the continuing to own an asset like the Gardiner and the DVP makes a whole lot of difference. If we're talking about Ontario Place, never ours in the first place, and there can be debate about what the city could have done, but at the end of the day, the province has the ability to do what it does there. We don't have to agree. So I know the New Deal has lots of detractors, but that probably means that we got in the room and did some of the things that we need to do. And ultimately, we as public servants looked at it in terms of how can we achieve the goals that we have, that we've been provided to by our governing bodies. And ultimately, politicians needed to say, I can live with this and I can accept that. So that's only half an answer, because I can't get into the mind of the mayor, and I'm not going to share our many, many conversations over those 7 weeks, because I know it's hard politically. And I said to her on a few occasions, the one thing I'll share is I said, I'm going to bring you sometimes what we think is a really good path forward to look at the sustainability of the city. I know for you, it's a different set of questions that may be running through your mind, and I don't do any of this to put you into a corner. And she appreciated the comment, but I think, and then had to take that away. So I do think separating out some of the stuff that's happening in some of the legislation from some of the work that we're trying to do on sustainability of our financial situation does have to happen. We can be angry about certain things that are occurring that take away local autonomy, while at the same time being real practical that without the work done by the province and the federal government with the City of Toronto, we will have to scale back services, and I think that's a worse outcome than some of the things in the New Deal that I know were not things that people appreciated.
Okay, in the third row from the back, I think. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I appreciated your framing of this New Deal as in the context of a more productive relationship between the province and municipality. My question is around, you briefly mentioned that you're, maybe I misunderstood, you said you're agnostic about the potential for a more consistent, sustainable, ongoing source of funding. And in particular, I think it's fair to say that some critics have pointed to the way in which the City of Toronto has increased development charges precipitously in the past several years. And to me, that indicates a need for more sustainable sources of funding. So I'm curious, can you elaborate on that point? And secondly, what do you say to folks who might point to, I believe it's $2.6 billion of unused development charges, or about $5 billion across the province? I'm not sure exactly the numbers, but if you could provide some clarity on that. Thank you.
Sure. So the City of Toronto has large reserves in terms of numbers. There are billions of dollars in reserve, and the DC reserve is one of those that is multiple billions of dollars. I'll just say to you that if we look at sort of the $3.3 billion in development charges, it is leveraged, we have commitments of about $6 to $7 billion on that, and unfunded commitments in the future of another $6 billion. So I actually, when people say, you've got a lot of reserve, I go, yeah, and it's underfunded. And they go, well, can't you use it? I go, I could, but it's underfunded. I will say on development charges, however, we have started the conversation internally to say we need to look at two things. Whether we need to take a really forensic look at what's in those background studies and what we're putting into those development charge baskets when we go through that. And I'm not saying we've been wasteful in any way, but now is the time to look at it very strategically and determine, are there ways that we can extract some things out, be they whole projects or parts of things that we can include? And the other thing is the indexing. Do we have to index, midway through the year? Do we have to continue to do that, or can we look at another way? And we're going to set some very different targets for development charges as staff heading into the next background study, which we're going to get thinking about next year and bringing forward in due course. The last thing I'll say, because I appreciate you commenting that I was not clear, I am very committed to finding a sustainable source of funding for the City of Toronto. I'm agnostic on exactly what that would look like in terms of the tool, if you like. So if someone would say, we're really going to look at it as a transfer, think of the transfer that happens from the federal government to the provincial governments, and say that's the mechanism we're going to do, and index that, okay. If it is, we're going to have you share in growth-related taxes, sales tax or income tax, okay. We're working to a number. It has to be a number that grows, because it doesn't matter if it's say, well, $800 million annually starting next year, great, but 10 years from now, that 800 million is going to be what? 600 million and everything else. So we have to keep the gap going. So thank you for allowing me to clarify that. The agnostic part is I don't want to go into the discussion personally and say the only path to this is a share of sales tax. Now, if that's what everybody decides politically is the only conversation to have, okay, we'll have that conversation. I doubt that's going to be it. But if we go in and say this is about another sum of money that doesn't grow, we've been down this road again. It may sustain us for 5 years or 6 years this next time around, but I'd really like, in terms of legacy politically and bureaucratically for the City of Toronto in the next couple of years, wouldn't it be great if we were to say to council and say to the leadership bureaucratically that you don't have to do this fight every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. You'll have plenty to fight about, and you'll have plenty of gaps that will still need to be filled. But as I say often at the table, we have a rate system that works when you look at solid waste, when you look at water. I don't come to the table at the New Deal talking about solid waste. I don't come to the table talking about how we do some of our maintenance programs. It is those big ticket items that if we don't fundamentally change either the revenue stream or who actually pays for it in the first place, we're just going to do this over and over and over again.
Okay. Mr. Bradford. We coming close to a shot clock foul here, so let's try and keep
Thanks very much, Paul Bedford. I just want to follow up on that question, and I want to look ahead 10 years. March the 6th, 2034, Toronto will turn 200. 10 years away. What's your crystal ball? What's your sense about revenue sources, whatever they may be, by that time frame? You talked a lot about focus, and I think that's a pretty good date to focus on. Could it be delegated authority for new revenue sources from the province? Could it be the share of, sales, income tax, road tolls, God knows what else? You're very familiar with other cities, what they do around the world. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are over that next 10-year period.
It would be wonderful if we had a city that could really be self-determining where it is headed from a financial perspective and isn't really beholden to grant-related programs and all the rest. It is a terrible way to run a city that contributes 53% or 52% of the gross domestic product of the province of Ontario. And so, again, I might have ideas. I might have read some good ideas about how we might structure that. I don't know that that's the only idea. But if 10 years from now, the City of Toronto held much more, to go back to the early question, much more of its own control, and this doesn't dive us into charter cities and all the rest. That may be another conversation for another day. But financially, I'd love to have council debating about how we'll manage the growth of our finances as well as managing the growth of this city. Right now, we manage the growth of the city without a lot of levers to figure out how to manage the growth of the resources. That's managed by, we're going to need more. That's managed by, we've got a huge backlog. I'd love us to be able to do both at the same time and make those decisions at the City of Toronto level.
Paul, I'm afraid that while I know I could listen to you all night, we are out of time, and so I'm going to have to call on Enid to come up and bring this incredibly enjoyable conversation to a close.
Well, thank you very much. That was an incredibly enjoyable conversation. And I know you said you could go on for a long time, but we are going to give you a break. And we do have a tradition of a city manager's address here. We also have a tradition of ending on time. so we're going to stick to that today. Thanks to both of you, Paul and Sabine, for providing a really interesting discussion. Paul, thank you for going behind the scenes for us and telling us a little bit about how this New Deal actually came about, things that I don't think people knew about. I'm excited by what Sabine refers to as your admirable optimism. If the city manager of the City of Toronto isn't optimistic, then we're all in trouble. So I really appreciate your optimism. And I love your last slide, to be continued, because there's lots more going on, lots more to talk about. New Deal 2.0 to come. I'm starting to see this now as a 3-part series. You know, there was last year, this year, and obviously next year is going
I'll
to be...
do a costume change, I promise.
Well, I don't know, Sabine. I was quite happy to be wearing something different than the slide last year, so I'm sure you were too. So just to say that tonight's event, as I said at the beginning, was live streamed, and it has also been recorded. The recording will be available on our website and our YouTube channel in about a week's time. And before I leave you, I just want to share with you that IMFG is about to celebrate its 20th anniversary at the end of this year. It's hard to believe, Alan, that we co-founded the Institute 20 years ago. But we are planning an event at the end of January to mark this milestone. We're going to have some panels of people talking about what they wrote for us 20 years ago, what they think now, what they think is going to be like 20 years from now. Little like the question Paul was asking. So come back and we will send out invitations shortly to that event. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for those who are on the live stream, and I hope you have a great evening.